quarter-past now. Welcome back from your break, everybody. I'm just going to do a quick introduction. So I'd like to welcome Sabine Little from the University of Sheffield, who's going to be talking to us about multilingualism in the library. So I'll let you take over.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, by way of introduction, I need to say that I'm not a librarian. I'm a senior lecturer in languages education, but I am talking about work that I have done in collaboration with the library and with the amazing support of Sheffield Libraries. What I research is anything to do with multilingualism, identity and belonging. So I typically look at the child or the family and then look at everything that touches on how a child might grow up multilingually, and public spaces like the library are one of the aspects, of course, that touch on the child's experiences of growing up multilingual. So that's where this work stems from. I want to start, there you go, I couldn't get that to advance in a second, with a quick brief quote from Pura Belpré, and in this context you might know about her more than in other contexts when I talk about. She was a Puerto Rican and the first Puerto Rican librarian in New York in the 1960s, and did a lot of work around multilingual storytelling in that sphere. And she talks about, in some of her writing is quite difficult to find now, but she talks about languages being lost in the process of assimilation. And I'm reminded of modern times when we talk about integration, or rather government policy documents talk about integration, but what they mean more often than not is assimilation. So this whole juxtaposition of integration versus assimilation, them not having to be the same, is part of the things that I talk about when I talk in a policy context. This is a favorite quote of mine, and I have it in almost every talk, I have to say. The idea that literacy is not neutral, but a social practice, and that there can only be the term literacy if we ignore the ubiquity of literacies. And one of the things that my work focuses on is this idea that it's not either or, but both and, as in when we look at multilingual literacies in the English curriculum, it's now very clear that when the curriculum document talks about language and literacy development, it talks about English language and literacy development, not multilingual multiliteracy development. So understanding how multilingualism might fit into this space is again part of the things that I'm talking about. But I thought that you might like that quote and might want to use it in other spaces. One of the reasons for my interest in this work is my own son. And this is what he read in German when he was 9 and what he read in English when he was 9. On the right-hand side is what was then the newest Alex Rider. And on the left-hand side is a German book aimed at roughly 6-year-olds, I think. I think that's what it said on the back. To the extent to which we believe in publishers' guidelines of age. But what I was interested in was also making multiliteracies or multilingual books accessible to a wide readership, especially heritage language learners who might often develop asynchronously across their various languages. And how can we make sure in our work that they are not disadvantaged or drawn out, or having their identity questioned with the level of reading and books that they are engaged in. Another very brief quote by Pura Belpré, the idea of books being aimed at the immigrant child, and that these books were portraying adjustment problems. I think we have come part of the way. I think not all books featuring children from migration backgrounds talk about the difficulty of settling in. But we're not there yet in terms of the diversity of representation and making sure that we have that diversity in the library. What happened at the same time that Pura Belpré was doing her work is that I did a bit of research historically on libraries in the UK. And in 1967, 33 out of 50 public libraries that were part of this research study had some provision for community languages. But again, here it is the idea that several said that providing such books was detrimental to the interest of encouraging integration. And Lambert, the not very clever author of this report, concluded that where multilingual books were provided, there was take up and people were using them. But where there were no books, there was no requests for them. And therefore he decided that actually, you know, they were probably not needed, because if they weren't there, they weren't being missed, rather than unpacking all the notions around access, accessibility, understanding services, etc. So part of the question then is, you know, what happens if you build a multilingual children's library? And that was against this backdrop what we did in Sheffield. So for those who are not quite aware, we are at the point where roughly 20–25% of pupils in primary and secondary are registered as having English as an additional language. I do actually have an issue with that term in and of itself, but I'm not going to go into that today because I will be ranting all day. I call them emergent multilinguals. But language is predominantly treated as a deficit model. So multilingual pupils are a problem if they do not speak English sufficiently to follow the curriculum, and beyond that they become invisible. My son's multilingualism is invisible because his English is not in any way, shape or form inhibiting his learning. So yeah, there's a sort of a background here for people to quickly read through. But when you research multilingual families, as I do, there is a lot there in the social experience. And I've done research around how children experience Trump and other past and future presidents, and how they experience Brexit. And these are the sorts of things that children have told me. That one child told me, I'm in year 6, nobody in the school knows that I speak Hungarian. In a research project where I was trying to capture multilingual reading, all the children told me about was their English reading, because I was a white adult in a school context. I visited them in school, and when I finally cracked that I was interested in multilingual reading, one of the children said, oh, I read all the Harry Potter books in Bengali, but why do you want to know about that? Nobody wants to know about that. And I find that one of the most frustrating quotes of my career, so I try to use it often. So what happened? As part of my work, I ran a multilingual storytelling event. And after that, I got talking with the library, and we repeated the event in the children's library here in Sheffield. And it was so successful that we had to check the health and safety regulations to make sure that we actually had only the number of people in the library that were actually physically allowed in the library. So following on from that, we established the Multilingual Children's Library. And one of the things I often get asked before going into the nitty-gritty of what we actually did is, well, there are so many options for digital book reading, digital borrowing. But actually, there were a number of things that were really important to this project. One was access to resources, whether or not computers were readily available to families. A big part for me was the visibility of multilingualism in the city. It wasn't just about provision to the families. It was to hang out our shingle to say Sheffield is multilingual. Anybody can come to these events. Anybody can take out these books. And we wanted to make sure that the multilingualism of the city was very much front and center of this project. We wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for local ownership and self-efficacy. So we included things like donation drives among heritage language schools. We involved families and the general public in multilingual storytelling. We wanted to make sure that this multilingual children's library was part of everybody in the city. And I've got some quotes to finish on. We wanted to make sure that there were events. Of course, we did this work pre-COVID. And of course, since then, there have been many, many online events during COVID as well. We wanted to make sure that we supplied multiple age ranges. We looked at the literacy gap across languages. So essentially, what we wanted to make sure was that there was a visible physical space that was easy to access and that was already recognized and valued by the community with experience and expertise in literacy development and support. I'm aware of and very grateful for a number of community-run libraries. In our instance, we were quite clear that we wanted to collaborate with Sheffield libraries. We didn't want the multilingual library to be in a separate building or a separate room. So it's actually in the same room. It's a multilingual section as part of the main library. So these three rights essentially were underpinning in the work that I did with the library. The first was the right to feel valued, to be worthy, essentially, to be there. The right to normalization. We didn't want any special treatment. We wanted the multilingual books to be exactly where all the other books were. And the right to physically take up space. And those were really, really important to us, whether that was space in events of using the space of the library or simply the shelf space as well. So what we did is the library was incredibly supportive, and they helped with staffing costs. So they said, yeah, they had the space and they had the staffing. What they did not have was a budget for books. And that was a kind of a double-edged sword. Of course, it would have been a lot easier if we'd just been able to go out and say, right, you know, have so and so many £1,000 worth of orders. But actually what it did force us to do was go through the communities, and we had donation drives. I've now got a bit of a reputation with authors who are sending me their translations of books, and publishers who are doing the same. So I get a number of author copies from certain authors, etc. So when I say that the library was stocked with kindness and hard work, we had a social media drive called Bring a Book Back, or bring a book home during the holidays. So when you go on holiday at the airport, buy a children's book and bring it home. And we had a bit of a hashtag going with that. And that again supported the library getting well known. It was catalogued by determination because the librarians were not multilingual. So again, and I speak a number of languages, but not all of the languages that were represented in the library. So again, we had to collaborate with heritage language schools. We had to take photos, because any of you who work in council libraries, non-council workers, were not allowed to access the catalogue. So they were, even though we had volunteers to do the cataloguing, they weren't able to. So I had to be a bit of a bridge there. And we had a heck of a lot of support from publishers, authors, illustrators, translators, heritage language schools, and the general public. So we ran a number of events, and I'm going to say a little bit about that later, but these are just some of the quotes that happened during our very first multilingual storytelling event. This is the first time my daughter heard our language spoken in a public place. This was actually a mother who volunteered to read a story in the library for precisely this reason, because her daughter had only ever heard the language at home or when out and about. Her daughter, she was 5, had never experienced that their language was worthy of taking up space in the public library. There was a whole language, the Spanish language school in Sheffield. I'm going to say gate crash, and I mean that in the most positive way. They turned up like the elves in Lord of the Rings, with dozens of people supporting the storytelling events. The next quote was from a white male British person. I'd never heard Bengali before. It's a beautiful language. So the purpose of sensitizing, making people aware of Sheffield's multilingualism has been achieved. And then we stayed for 6 languages just for fun. So people stayed, even though through languages that they did not speak, to become more aware of how languages work, how they sound like, etc. If I forget, all the illustrations that I'm sharing are free and are available for anybody to use as long as they are accredited. There's a link at the end of the talk, because that was part of the funding that I got to pay an illustrator to do some specific illustrations for the Multilingual Children's Library. And I said that I would only do that if it became available for everybody. We ran a multilingual reading scheme, which is shamelessly borrowing from the summer reading scheme. So you can see there, children read 6 books in languages other than English. Again, that reading passport is available online. They gave a bit of a 5-star rating. And then in our case, they got a bit of a stamp when they took the book back to the library. And then we had an event where children received, if they did that, they received a certificate and a medal. And from a research perspective, very briefly, I'm not going to talk a lot about the research aspect, but when you do research, you get data and you code the data, trying to work out, you know, what is important about what is being said. And I've got this same quote twice, and I've coded it twice. On the one hand, here in green, is the impact that it had in terms of different people. So because we formalized a reward system for multilingual reading, multilingual children very rarely have an opportunity to celebrate their multilingualism, to share it in a normalized way, in a way that we share, you know, people have sports medals, etc. You don't get a medal for speaking Bengali. So what we did was we normalized multilingualism into something concrete, into an artifact that children could take to school to show and tell and say, look, I got a reward for reading books in a language other than English. So you can see here it went into, you know, people other than her parents, families, friends, school, the teacher and friends. So it gave the child the tools to talk about her multilingualism in a positive way. And then again, the same on here, it's the same quote, but just looking at the emotions then that the mum in this case was mentioning about pride, praise and confidence, which I thought was really important to look at that in this context. I want to make sure that there is some time for questions, which is why I'm racing through this, but the slides are available. What have we learned in terms of families? So we have learned that the Multilingual Children's Library added status to heritage languages. There was a close collaboration with heritage language schools, and that meant that we were sharing expertise, we spread the word. And for anybody thinking of doing something like this, I would hugely encourage you to find out which heritage language schools are near you and rope them in to support any work that you are doing if you haven't already done that. So the visibility in the public space were really important. But it did need somebody with time on their hands, and that in this context, that was me, to be the bridge to the community. And in other places, they might already be a bit more advanced to have somebody there. Some quotes from parents that came out of the project. Again, I said at the beginning, I look at multilingualism, identity and belonging. So this parent said, being in a city that recognizes the cultural diversity, language diversity felt good. It made Sheffield unique. You know that even though there's just a small group of you in the city, that you are worthy of space in the library. And here it makes you feel like you belong more. Now, if there is space for us in the library, I feel like I belong more. Which was obviously what I was hoping to achieve with the project. From a logistical level, here's a photo of one of our storytelling events. The customers valued it. Something that's really important for anybody wanting to do this. We had to have a think about what success meant, because quite often I learned from the librarians, success was measured in the number of issues, the number of times a book is being issued. But actually, when I spoke to the parents, what they were saying is, well, there's only 7 books in our language. So what we tend to do is we read it in the library, because that is what the space is all about. It's the fact that it is in the library. If we take it home, then it's just the home language in the home. But if we read it in the library, then that is about the public space. And then they said we leave it behind for other people to read. So the books didn't necessarily get issued. They didn't necessarily get a stamp to say that they were taken out by people, but they were used. So we had to think a little bit about, actually maybe success must be measured differently in this kind of context. We found that it wasn't what we had devised it for, but it was used for language learners as well. And actually loads of multilingual kids would dabble and just randomly borrow books in other languages as well, just because they could and just because they were there. And the library concluded that there should be a multilingual element to future programming beyond this was originally a pilot, but the section is still there, and so the work is ongoing. All sorts have happened since we originally launched. There's been a multilingual storytelling event, a story writing event. One of the most fun things was a multilingual readathon, where we had this was a publisher who got in touch with us and said, we're bringing out a new bilingual picture book. Would you like a whole bunch of copies, provided you're going to do something with it? So I said, yes, what we're going to do is we're going to do a multilingual readathon. There were 20 languages, I think, available. And I put out a call and said, does anybody speak these languages? We're going to try and see how many of them we can get read in one afternoon. And I think we got 14, if I remember correctly. And since then, I know lots of schools that have run multilingual readathons, not necessarily with the same book, for fundraising and highlighting multilingualism. So that was a fun and visible event as well. And the author came and she read the book in English. The links with heritage language schools were really important. I mentioned the awards ceremony. Exchange, I mentioned the Kittiwake Trust in Newcastle. So they have a specific library, a volunteer-run library. They're currently waiting for new premises, and then also the Multilingual Children's Library in Vienna. We hosted the EB Honours List for translated books, or for books in other languages. The library section, it was getting rather big, so we were trying to work out, or we are trying to work out what to do, spreading into other libraries. There were multiple blog podcast entries, articles, etc. Schools who are getting in touch. And again, there was a bit of a knock-on effect that heritage language schools, some of them had their own multilingual library. And when I say library, I mean box. And 2 of Sheffield's multilingual library, multilingual heritage language schools actually donated their box to the Multilingual Children's Library and said we would rather they were here in the public space than it being a box that gets carted to every Saturday school. So again, it was a win-win situation. The heritage language school got the more street cred, or the more acknowledgement of space for their language. And at the same time, they didn't have to deal with issuing the books and getting them back, etc. And the work won the Brenda Eastwood Award for Diversity and Inclusion from the UK Literacy Association, which was a lovely thing. In terms of what we still need to learn, this work, as I said, happened before COVID, and I think COVID has taught us a little bit about how marginalised communities have become, in some instances, more visible across multiple spaces. I'm not saying good work cannot take place online. And again, I think COVID has taught us something there. There's definitely something about improving logistics and infrastructure, about maintenance, expansion, and how societies change and readerships change, and more connections, collaborations, and learning from each other, which is one of the reasons why I'm so delighted to be here. This is the link at the bottom, the resources. That's where the images are. That's where the reading passport is. And for anybody who wants to read the full paper, there's a link there as well. And here are my contact details again. And I'm going to come out of the presentation now because I'm hoping we left some time for questions, and I can see the chat, but I can't read it at the moment. So I'm going to come out of the share and see if we've got a bit of time for questions.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That was such a great presentation, and I think you can call yourself an honorary librarian for all of that work. I'm pretty sure I have that in my power to grant that. So we do have 7 minutes for questions. So feel free to either pop them into the chat or raise your hand and unmute yourself. I think in line with what you were saying about, the right to take up space, I'd really like to prioritize anyone who has a question who is multilingual themselves or perhaps works in public libraries or school libraries. If anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question. While we're waiting for people to do that, I had a question actually. I was going to ask, did you have anything within these the sessions that you did around sort of oral storytelling traditions, and how did they sort of fit in with the reading as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we did we called them storytelling sessions, which is not anybody who's worked with storytellers. That's not entirely accurate because many of them were shared reading sessions. But we also had people who would just would just tell a story. as well. So it was both literacy and oracy development. And I'm particularly mindful of people from the Roma community who were essentially talking about well, actually, there isn't a written version of all languages necessarily. So we had to make sure that oral language sharing was supported as well.
Lovely, thanks. And I've worked with storytellers before as well, and they're incredible how they can bring something to life. There's a question in the chat from Natalie that says, I'd be interested to hear more about your thoughts on terminology of English as an additional language versus multilingual and how that impacts people.
Sure. So, I mean, when EAL is in the school context very much around a deficit model. A prime example for this is that actually my son, I mentioned, is growing up bilingual, and he was never on the school EAL register until the government changed the funding and sent EAL funding directly to schools rather than to the council, and made it dependent on the number of EAL registered children. And at that precise moment, we got an email from the school saying, could they put our son on the EAL register? So this shows how if you are on the EAL register, it is because the school has recognized that you require extra funding to succeed, which is a sort of deficit model. Whereas the idea of the emergent multilingual or emergent bilingual talks about a journey that you are on, which will lead to multilingualism. The English as an additional language forefronts English and does not mention any of the other languages that a child might speak. Whereas the concept of the emergent multilingual equalizes all languages and gives space for the child to tell you about what other languages there might be in that space. I hope that makes sense. It's a very short explanation.
That's great, thanks. Just checking for any other questions. Yeah, so there's a question here that says, were there any challenges in being able to involve the public libraries? And Helen says, no longer a public library, but my local council had a strong and poor reputation of not giving library staff the opportunities, support to be able to introduce new initiatives and programmes. Did you have those conversations with the council decision makers, or were they massively happy to be involved?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think that it was, I dealt with the library and their outreach manager, and they were absolutely delighted to be involved under the remit that I described, that they would donate the space and the staff time, but not the budget. Of course, we all know that staffing is a very real budget. And I think what they took away from that was that it was a lot more time intensive than they had originally envisaged. So it was frustrating from my perspective at times, because things weren't getting catalogued as much as normal, because staff weren't getting additional time to do the cataloguing. They had to fit it in next to all their other duties. So there was a time where we were about 300 books behind in the cataloguing, which I found insanely frustrating, but not blaming the library at all, blaming the circumstances within the council. So yes, I would say that there were definitely issues, and in a perfect world, there would have been, an additional librarian, real money behind the time, rather than, oh yes, we'll just do that as well as our day-to-day jobs. So yes, I would say it was definitely not without challenge. People were happy to be involved, but there were certainly issues in terms of time and the cost that entailed.
Thanks. I don't think I can see any other questions, unless anyone has a quick one if they want to pop their hand up. Eva, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hello. Hi. I first wanted to echo what Sabine said about the EAL. My children, I'm Catalan, my husband is English, and their English, really, it's been their first language, but the school kept sending us letters saying they had English as an additional language, and I kept sending letters saying, no, they don't have English as an additional language. I mean, if you see them and you speak to them, you can see that their English, you know, they are native speakers. So that was something that always irritated me. But my question was about, you said that you approach like heritage schools to try to get to those communities. How did you try to approach other communities that might be like minority communities of minority languages that don't have a heritage school? And how did you do that? And was it successful? Yeah.
Yes, so the heritage language schools were obviously easier because they had points of contact, etc. We have got multiple cultural centres which are not language schools, and we contacted those as well. I do have to say that they were not as easy to integrate, partially because not all their work revolved around children necessarily, and this was very much specifically a children's library. So some of them were about you know, getting young adults into work, for example. So they were less interested in picture books or even non-picture books. So we did try, and I would say, if I'm honest, we had more input from the heritage language schools, but we did have some input from cultural centres, but also just from the general public. So one of the things that came out of this is that I now run a Multilingual Families Sheffield and South Yorkshire Facebook group, which it's not particularly big. It's got about 150 people in it or something like that. It's growing, but that was a good place to advertise. Oh, there's a new storytelling event. Does anybody want to take part? And now it is being used by, we're new to Sheffield, we speak Hungarian, is there anybody else around? So a little multilingual community has actually grown around the project in a way.
Great, thank you.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much again. We're going to have to finish there to make sure that everybody has time to have a break for our next session, but I'd ask everybody to express their thanks in the chat. And thank you again so much. It's such a really interesting project. And yeah, I can see that there's people that are going to take some of this and I think have a go at trying something similar themselves. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.